If there's one thing we've learned about Oni from the past several stories, it's that Oni are not a single, well-defined, and uniform class of monsters. They are varied and diverse. And just because most Oni like to feast on their victims after ripping them to shreds, and do what they do more out of hunger than of cruelty, today's story shows us a demon that demonstrates just how varied and evil these Oni could actually be. Yokoso owashitare, and welcome back to another classical Japanese folktale. If you like Japanese history, or you like Japanese culture, or you just like storytelling in general, please don't forget to like the video and please subscribe to the channel because there are plenty more of these stories where this one came from, and there are still many more spooky stories about ghosts and Oni that we have to get through as well. So please subscribe to the channel, and with all of that out of the way, let's get on with the story. Once upon a time, imawa mukashi. There was a man who was getting ready to head to the capital from the east. The reason for his excursion was fairly simple. He was a fairly wealthy man, but lacked an official title of any sort. And he wanted to change that. The exact words in the story are eishaku o kawam, which means something like, he intended to buy a court rank. Now, I don't know the full extent of how this worked. After all, nobility was largely determined by birth and not money or merit, but it does seem like for some of the lower court ranks and jobs, if you were wealthy enough, and possibly if you had a good enough pedigree, it was perfectly normal to trade some goods for an appointment. And so, with his eye on an official title, this man began getting himself ready for a long trip to the capital. But during the course of his travel preparations, naturally, this man's wife learned about his intentions, and hit out an idea herself. Since her husband was heading to the capital anyway, she could take this opportunity to go with him and see the place for herself. The capital, after all, was the center of culture and beauty for the whole country. Its size, elegance, and sheer gorgeousness were legendary all throughout Japan at the time. And this man's wife, who, even though she was likely a person of some decent standing, had spent her whole life living out in the rural eastern provinces and wanted to see the legendary wonders of the capital with her own eyes. To see all of the beautiful houses and the temples and the high-ranking aristocrats decked out in the most lavish and elegant styles. Maybe she could even make some classy friends that could keep her up to date on all of the latest fashions and the doings of the most sophisticated and important people in the country. Perhaps also, if she was lucky, she could even get her hands on some of that beautiful clothing for herself and have something to take back home and stir up fancy dreams of living the high life and remind her of the wonders of the capital. She might not ever be able to enter the upper echelons of high society herself, but hey, a woman can dream, can't she? When the woman told her husband that she wanted to come with him to the capital, he was more than happy to assent. What better way to strengthen a marital bond than an extended road trip to the capital? After all, the capital was also the setting for many romantic stories. Needless to say, both this man and his wife were ecstatic to visit the city. The road there was rather uneventful. The text makes no mention of anything notable that happened. But trouble began as soon as they arrived in the city proper. The text doesn't elaborate why. But when this couple and the several servants that they had brought with them arrived at the place they had originally intended to stay, something happened. A problem of some sort arose and they weren't able to stay there. To make matters worse, this couple hadn't made any backup plans in case their original plans fell through, nor did they have any close relatives who lived in the city that they could just waltz up to and expect to be accommodated. Now, this was a big disappointment, to be sure. But the man was a very capable and likely a fairly wealthy person and wasn't about to be discouraged by this one setback. Once the situation was clear, and they had come to terms with the fact that they wouldn't be able to stay at the place they originally intended, the man set about contacting some of his connections there in the city. And as luck would have it, he managed to get in touch with an old acquaintance who came to their rescue. This acquaintance told the couple and their entourage that the place known as Kawaranoin hardly had anyone who went there anymore. This acquaintance was apparently in charge of upkeeping the place, despite its lack of residents. I guess some buildings are just fancy enough that very wealthy patrons would pay to keep them taken care of, even if they weren't being used. And it just so happened that this acquaintance had access to the place, and he was happy to let this couple and let their servants shelter under its roof for the duration of their stay in the city. Now, an essentially abandoned house wasn't ideal, obviously. That meant that they would have to take care of food, cleaning, and all of the natural labor of living by themselves instead of relying on a host. But given their situation, it kind of made sense. And it wasn't like this couple was incapable of or opposed to fending for themselves. Not only that, but Kawaranoin had, in the past, been quite the important place. It was a building that had seen its fair share of parties by the high nobility, and even the emperor. It may not have been bustling with people at that period of time, but it was a quasi-legendary place that had a history of hosting some of the most fine people in the country. Definitely not the worst option. The man gratefully accepted this acquaintance's offer, and then he, his wife, and their people all headed for Kawaranoin. When they arrived, it looked just as the man's acquaintance had described. It didn't seem like there was a single soul staying there. They had the whole place to themselves. But not wanting to seem overly presumptuous, the man decided that instead of installing everybody in the main building, he had one of the hanachi-ides, a smaller offshoot building that was still connected to the rest of the house but clearly distinct, done up for him and his wife. He had various curtains, screens, and other partitioning objects brought in, and there he and his wife made themselves very comfortable. The servants, after making sure that their lord and lady were set up properly, found a cozy place off to the side, and after securing the horses in the stables, took up residence in their little area and brought out a bunch of food and drink that they had stocked up for their journey. While it wasn't ideal, again, the place that they had originally wanted to stay in likely would have been able to meet a whole host of needs without the couple having to do anything, but this setup wasn't bad at all. Everyone was more or less happy with the situation. They had made it to the capital in one piece. They had a roof over their heads, food to eat, and lots of free time and space in one of the most grandiose places in the whole of the country. Again, things could have been much, much worse. And so, the party spent the next few days staying at Kawaranoin, and whiled away the time. Well, I don't actually know what they did. Maybe they did what everyone does when they visit Kyoto, and went out for a bit of sightseeing, going to see all of the usual places like Fushimi Inari Taisha, Kiyomizu-dera, and Kinkakuji, except probably not because those places didn't exist like they do now, and the last one straight up just didn't exist at all until several centuries later. Just making sure you Japanese history nerds are paying attention, heh. Maybe they got out into the city proper to see the palace and all of the fancy high nobility in their ox-drawn carriages and their super billowy clothing spilling out from under the blinds. It's also totally possible that they didn't go anywhere and just hung around Kawaranoin, resting up from their very, very long time on the road. Again, we don't know what they did over the next few days, so I'll leave it up to your imagination. Let me know in the comments what you would do if you were in their position. But one evening, just as the sun was setting, everyone was gathered at the building and simply enjoying the last several minutes of sunlight and doing whatever. The servants were in their usual spot, eating and drinking, and just having a generally good time. The husband was sitting somewhat close to the entrance of this Hanachi-ide building that they were staying in, probably enjoying the view of the garden, with the wife being deeper inside, close to the double doors that led to the main part of the house, the part that they weren't staying in. Things were quiet and peaceful, and they couldn't have imagined a better vacation. But this picturesque peace was suddenly broken when the aforementioned double doors that led to the deeper parts of the property suddenly swung open from the inside with a loud crash. Immediately, the husband's attention snapped toward these now open doors and saw nothing. The doorway was completely empty. What the heck? After a second of very clear confusion, the man concluded that there must have been someone living deeper in the house and that they had been the ones who had opened the door. But why would they not make themselves known first? And why weren't they standing in the doorway? The manager of this place, the man's acquaintance, had said that no one else was staying here. Does that mean somebody snuck in? Were they trying to steal something from him and his wife? What kind of person other than a thief would do something like this? Maybe a prankster of some sort? A whole plethora of questions flashed through this man's head in an instant, but before he could give voice to any of them, his eyes fell on his wife, who was sitting fairly close to these double doors as she turned toward them to inspect them herself. And then, in a single flash, an unnatural-looking hand and arm shot out from the doorway, grabbed the man's wife, and began violently dragging her into the next room. The husband sprang to his feet as fast as he could and sprinted toward his wife. But between the speed of this thing, its power, and the suddenness of its attack, he couldn't reach her in time, and she disappeared into the darkness of the next room, and the double doors slammed shut. The husband practically crashed into these doors in his hurry and grabbed one of them and tried pulling it open. But the door didn't move. He pulled again. Nothing. Again, he pulled and he pulled with everything that he had, but the doors didn't budge. Giving up on these double doors, he frantically looked around for another means of ingress and found another set of double doors. He tried opening them, and the same thing. They were locked shut. He found another, smaller door and pulled on it, this way and that, but it wouldn't budge. It seemed that every entryway on this side of the building was locked from the inside. Now, full-on panicking, the man raced around the entirety of the building that his wife had disappeared into, trying every door and every window that he could find. Nothing. The place was locked tighter than a castle under siege. Not knowing what else to do and still freaking out, the man sprinted as fast as possible out of the premises of Kawaranoin and to the house next door. Arriving at the gate, he desperately yelled out to whoever was there, explaining what had happened and begging for help. The next moment, a group of men came bounding out of the gate, some armed with various tools, and they followed him back to Kawaranoin and the main building that his wife had disappeared inside of. These neighbors quickly set about trying their luck with the doors and the windows, but of course, they fared no better, and by the time they had tried all of the entrances, the sun had completely sunk behind the mountains. With the husband growing ever more desperate, one of the men who happened to bring an axe with him came forward and told everyone to stand back. He then took a few hard swings at one of these sets of double doors, and within just a minute or so had it cut open. Now with a way in, the men all lit torches and flooded inside, not knowing exactly what they would find. Whatever had dragged this man's wife in there had already had plenty of time to do all sorts of terrible, terrible things. But while everyone was ready for some kind of a fight, or to find the wife's remains bloodily strewn about, they were first met with the sight of a dark room with nothing immediately out of place. Furthermore, not a soul was stirring. Neither the wife nor the thing that grabbed her. No screams, nor sounds of struggle, no pleas for rescue from the clutches of a terrible beast, just silence and darkness. The men swiftly searched the room with their torches, and it only took a few seconds for them to come across the man's wife, or at least what was left of her. She was folded over a long horizontal pole used for drying clothes, very clearly not moving. They moved closer to inspect her, and it only took a brief look to confirm their worst fears. She was dead. But while finding a dead woman was already bad enough, what was more disconcerting was the state her body was in. She didn't seem to have a single scratch on her, no bloody wounds, no bruises from being strangled, nothing like that. But there was something else about her body. The text uses another word here that is illegible in the original manuscript that further describes the state her body was in. But while we don't know what that word is because it's missing, when the men all saw her hanging there, draped over this pole and looking like however she was looking, they all began murmuring to each other in quiet horror. It must have sucked out her insides. With that in mind, I imagine that the missing word was something like withered, limp, or some other form of lacking in mass. The Oni, after draining this woman of her blood and her innards and turning her into a sack of skin and bones, and I guess wanting to rub it in everyone's faces, decided to highlight what it had done to this woman by hanging her empty, flaccid body up like a piece of clothing before vanishing into thin air. The husband, obviously, was devastated. His wife was gone, murdered and devoured in one of the most grotesque ways imaginable. But more than just grief-stricken, he was also terrified. How long had they been sharing a roof with an Oni? How much did it know about them? If it was so cruel and depraved as to do something like this, maybe it had it out for them, and he was next on the menu. Furthermore, he just couldn't bear seeing his wife like this, and so the man fled. The only thing the text says is that he went somewhere else. We have no idea if he returned home, if he stayed in the capital to secure his court position, if he held a funeral for his wife. Nothing. All it says is that he ran somewhere that wasn't that horrible place. And that is actually the end of the story. But as per usual, we do have one final moral lesson. And thus is it said that you should never, ever take up residence in old places that you don't know anything about, which, if you can't tell, seems to be the biggest recurring theme of these Oni stories. Stay away from places where there is a lack of people, which is a little bit of bad news for me because I'm not the biggest people person, and I find that living in relative solitude is actually right up my alley. But lest you think that I'm in danger of getting dined on by an Oni, I can tell you that the next story gives some advice on how you can protect yourself from them. But also, I want to hear what you guys think that the missing word was. The one that was used to describe the state of the woman's body and led everyone to believe that Oni no sui koroshi tekeru na meri. More literally translated something like, it seemed like the Oni sucked and killed her. And while the literal translation is a bit unwieldy in English, I'm pretty sure the idea is something akin to a vampire or a spider sucking all of the insides out of a victim. But again, that is actually the end of this story, so if you did find it interesting, please don't forget to like the video and please subscribe to the channel because, again, there are plenty more of these stories, plenty more Oni stories and spirit stories coming your way. And please share with your friends, please share with your anime friends, your Japanese history friends, your storytelling friends, your horror storytelling friends. I know horror storytelling is actually a really big thing here on YouTube. But with all of that being said, I am going to end it here. If you have been watching all the way up to the end, I thank you sincerely. Ito ureshiu koso haberikere, and hopefully we will see you next week for that other story that I was talking about that tells you some things that you can do in case of Oni. And I will say that although I'm pretty sure the people of Heian, Japan thought that this next story was really, really scary, I have to admit, you are probably going to find it at least a little bit silly, because I did. And it is a little bit silly. But anyways, please look forward to that. Thank you so much, guys. I'll catch you later. Goodbye.